Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. For the Tuesday episode this week, we're changing things up a little bit. With the Brexit referendum coming up on June 23rd, which will determine whether the United Kingdom remains a member of the European Union, we're going back to an interview we recorded on October 5th, 2014. In this episode, Daniel and I speak with Mr. Andy Duncan about British politics and Scottish secession. Mr. Duncan is an England-based financial derivatives lecturer who teaches mainly in New York, London, Dubai, and Singapore. He is the author of the novel Sword of Marathon under the pen name Jack England and has a series of financial lectures on the Mithril, that's MITHRIL, Money YouTube channel. You can follow his work at mithrilmoney.com, that's MITHRIL money.com, and at andyjamesduncan.wordpress.com. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/Scottish-secession. This will be the first of several episodes in which we discuss British politics in some form as the Brexit referendum nears.
So, could you briefly explain the party politics in the UK and which parties have the most influence and why?
Well, it's quite complicated at the moment. It's very, very interesting as well. There's three major political parties. They're all very, very close together. They argue vitriolically with each other as if they're really, really separated, but they're all very, very close. The three main parties are the Labour Party, which is ostensibly a socialist party. And then we have the Conservative Party. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Then we have the Conservative Party, which is nominally a right-wing kind of party, what you might call the Republican Party in the United States. And then we have the Liberal Party, a third party. They used to be very, very strong in the Victorian era with prime ministers like Gladstone and various others, but they disappeared in about 1918 in an election then, and they've been very, very small ever since. Now, they started off as a kind of classical Liberal Party, but they became more and more socialist over the decades. The Labour Party is what you might call a working man's working class socialist party. The Liberal Democrat Party is sort of a middle class intellectual socialist party, and the Conservative Party is it's the remnant of the feudal times, really. It's a strange mixture, amalgam of different groups. But Margaret Thatcher was the leader, who you may have heard of there, and it's a kind of It's a mixture of all sorts of different groups of the landed gentry, the City of London, the people who work in finance and so on in a kind of loose association. So they're the three main political parties. But professional politics has made them all very, very, very close to each other. For instance, at the last election, the British government has a budget of around £700 billion, which is about $1 trillion. And the three main parties were arguing tooth and nail over different spending commitments of around 10 billion. So they were arguing about spending commitments within 1 or 2% of each other, as if it was the difference between hell and heaven. But they're all committed to the same things. They're all committed to state education, state healthcare, state control of virtually everything, and so on and so forth. So there's the three parties. The other thing in the UK is we have about 620 MPs, members of Parliament. They're all elected in a first-past-the-post system. So in a particular area, everyone, let's say 100,000 people, will vote. And even if 49,000 people vote for the Labour Party and 51,000 people vote for the Conservative Party, it will be the Conservative MP who gets in. So the 49,000's opinions disappear. But the other thing about the constituencies is that they've all been very heavily gerrymandered over the decades. So I live in a constituency called Henley, and it's been a Conservative MP, Member of Parliament here, for probably its entire existence, probably 200 years. And it's virtually impossible, because of the way the seats are gerrymandered, to get the Conservative out. So the Labour Party have around 250 gerrymandered seats, which it's virtually impossible to get the Socialist Labour MP out of those. The Conservative Party have about 250 gerrymandered seats, where it's virtually impossible to get the sitting Conservative out of those. And that leaves about 120 what you might call battleground constituencies, where there's a whole, where they do actually fight each other, but the majority sort of go backwards and forwards between the two main parties. And then the Liberal Democrat Party, which is the third party, slips in and out and has varying amounts of MPs.
So how does UKIP fit into this system, and how does the Scottish National Party fit in?
Well, UKIP's been a very interesting development over the last couple of decades. It doesn't actually have any MPs, members of Parliament, in Westminster, Big Ben and all that, at the moment. Because of this gerrymandering first-past-the-post system, it's extremely difficult for it to get an MP because it needs 51,000 people or so concentrated in one gerrymandered small area. In order to get an MP. However, it does have widespread background support. So probably across the entire country, it probably has between 15 and 20% of the electorate follow the ideas of UKIP, which is basically to get out of the EU SSR, the Soviet Union of the EU, the European Union. But it can't translate that 20% into a first-past-the-post MP constituency because it needs 51% in any one particular area. However, it has done very, very well in European elections because the elections for the European Parliament, this would be like your elections for Congress, are based upon proportional representation. So because it has this sort of 20% of people in the country support it, it gets about 20% of the actually won the last European election. It actually got the most European MPs in the last election because people in this country are becoming increasingly hostile towards the EU, which they quite rightly see as this huge, unaccountable, bureaucratic, taxing, regulating monster. Kind of a Napoleonic dream of this huge bureaucratic structure. And also very recently, two Conservative MPs have defected to UKIP, and they've both resigned their seat in the House of Commons, which I suppose might be your kind of House of Representatives, and they're going to stand again very, very shortly, and they'll both probably go to win in a few weeks. At that point, UKIP will have its first two MPs. So we have a very, very weird democratic system in the UK. Even if they have these two MPs in a few weeks' time, they'll have 20% of popular support in the country, and they'll have about 0.5% of the number of MPs in the House of Commons. Now, at the next election, which is coming up in probably a year or two's time, and because of this first-past-the-post system, the leader of UKIP, the UK Independence Party, is Nigel Farage, who you may have heard of. Is a very, very popular guy. He's actually a European MP at the moment, but he's going to stand somewhere in the UK, and he'll probably win. A few more Conservative MPs may defect and stand and win. So UKIP might end up with between 10 and 15 MPs at the next election. Again, think of this, that's out of 600 or so. Right. So again, with 20% popular support in the country, they'll end up with about 2 or 3% of the MPs. So although they will have a very, very small number of MPs, and they have none at the moment, and they'll have two possibly in a few weeks' time, they're still a very, very powerful force, because they're very, very closely behind the Conservative Party in many, many seats in England, and they could knock out a lot of Conservative MPs. I can tell you the reasons why they'll do that if you'd like me to later, if you ask me about that. So the Conservative Party is terrified of the UK Independence Party.
So how likely do you think it is that they're going to build up steam?
I think they will. I think at the next election, they won the recent European elections, so they actually beat the Conservative Party and the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrat Party. They got the most voters, so they won a national election. Now, the history of UKIP is quite interesting. The Conservative Party has always been this loose amalgam of groups. It's been farmers and people in the City of London and various other what you might call right-wing types, kind of mercantilist, crony capitalist party, really. I mean, as an Austrian economist myself, I would say they're really, if you look at Hopper's a theory of capitalism, socialism, they're socialists. I mean, they believe in state control of virtually everything, and they agree with the NHS and so on. But there's been two major parts of the Conservative Party in the last 30 years. There's been the kind of ancien regime group, the kind of old traditionalist, what you might call the one party kind of conservatives, noblesse oblige conservatives from the past. And then there's been the free market kind of radical edge, Sir Keith Joseph, Margaret Thatcher conservatives. So these two groups have kind of cooperated with each other inside the Conservative Party over the last 30 or 40 years. But their major division has been the EU. The what you might call the one nation conservatives, the noblesse oblige, old-fashioned conservatives, have been pro-EU. Now, maybe 50, 60 years ago, these people were all pro the empire, pro the British Empire. But as they saw the British Empire fall away and collapse and dwindle and die, they switched their kind of thinking into, instead of Britain ruling the empire, Britain should be part of the empire of Europe. The more free market side, who were called about 20 years ago the Eurosceptic group, the free market people, they've always been against the EU because they see that as, quite rightly, I think, in my opinion, as a socialist enterprise to drown us in taxation and regulation and control and ultimately kind of bureaucratic slavery. So this schism, about 20 years ago, a large number of what you might call Eurosceptic Conservative MPs just and their supporters in the country just gave up on the Conservative Party and formed the UK Independence Party. Very, very tiny to start with. They had a few local councillors and a few very small elected politicians like that. But they've gradually, like a little snowball or a little acorn, they've grown and grown and grown and grown. So this snowball has grown. This acorn has become a small oak tree. People are also extremely disillusioned with the Conservative Party under David Cameron. David Cameron, who's the current Prime Minister, is just basically, his beliefs are mainly about, I am David Cameron and I want to be Prime Minister. And he will do anything in his power to be Prime Minister. He's got this horrible current coalition with the Liberal Democrat Party, where the Liberal Democrat Party, who remember intellectual socialists, have about a third of the control of the government. Nothing's changed really since Gordon Brown was Prime Minister. He was the last Prime Minister and he was the leader of the Labour Party, the ostensible outright socialist party. He was like a kind of mini-me Stalin, very, very despised by people who weren't socialists, really hardcore. I mean, in the Soviet Union, he would have been, Stalin's right-hand man or, very, very major figure like that. And since he's been deposed by David Cameron with this coalition between the Conservative Party and the Liberal Democrats, very little has changed. Nothing has changed in my life. Tax rates haven't changed. Government control of everything hasn't changed. The NHS hasn't changed. Nothing has changed. So David Cameron is all about preserving the power of David Cameron and his friends. So what that's led to in the country is a big disillusionment within the Conservative Party. And that's why the last European election meant, I think, many people switched to UKIP. Because UKIP, they'll deny this themselves, and their members may deny this, but they are, to me, the old Eurosceptic wing of the Conservative Party, the free market and semi-libertarian grouping that have gone outside the Conservative Party, formed a new party, and that's what UKIP is now to me. And they actually are becoming, as they're becoming bigger and more powerful, the Conservative Party itself is becoming more and more frightened of them. But UKIP itself is losing its what you might call libertarian edge. It's becoming what you might call, in quotes, professional. And to me, what that means is they can see power, they can sniff power. And I think they're slowly descending into the same trough of politics, of power politics, that all the other parties have descended into, where they're all going to dance on the head of a pin and just fight basically for whose turn it is this year to drive around in the ministerial limousines while the British government continues merrily on. But UKIP is still, I mean, I don't vote in elections. I'm a hoppy and anarcho-capitalist, so I think democracy is an evil system anyway. But if I was a Democrat and I did vote, then I would vote for the UK Independence Party, even if it just purely for the secessionary reason of getting out of the EU. So that's what is still very attractive about them. And I'm hoping at the next general election that they get, I mean, I'm predicting 15 members of Parliament, but if they got 100 and they got a sixth of the MPs, that would be fantastic. That would be a huge secessionary battering ram to hopefully drive the UK out of the EU.
So what chance is there of the UK leaving the EU at some point in the near future?
Well, it's actually quite good, and that's mainly because of UKIP. Now, the Conservative Party, led by David Cameron, and which still has a lot of people in it who are very, very pro the EU. Kenneth Clarke is a major figure in the Conservative Party. He's very pro-EU. Michael Heseltine is, again, another major background figure in the Conservative Party. He's very pro-EU. So there's a lot of old-fashioned one-nation conservatives, these noblesse oblige types, previously imperial supporting types who's still very, very pro the EU. And the Conservative Party itself doesn't really want to leave the EU, but it knows if it doesn't go through the motions of pretending, then it will lose many MPs to UKIP. So what David Cameron is currently doing is dancing delicately around these upturned knives of an EU referendum. So he doesn't really want to have an EU referendum where we vote to get out of the EU. And if an EU referendum is held, we will win, I think, and we will be able to get out of the EU. He doesn't really want to have that election, but he's got to promise that election, because if he doesn't promise that election, then he definitely loses the next election. So what he's saying is if the Conservative Party win the next general election, which is coming up in a year or so, he will have an EU referendum in or out of the EU. Now, David Cameron pledges, to use a very favourite political word, pledges many things and delivers very few of them. So if he has to promise an EU referendum to stop UKIP taking out hundreds of Conservative MPs, but if he actually does win the next election, I think he'll renege on that pledge. He'll come up with some excuses. So one of his major ministers, who you may have seen in the United States, William Hague, who's the current Foreign Secretary, William Hague basically just tells lies all the time. I know when William Hague is lying because he's talking. I mean, occasionally he tells the truth by accident. But he's been, and he probably beats himself up over that. But he's been telling, he was very famous because he went to a Conservative Party conference when he was a young boy. I think he was about 14 or 15 at a Conservative Party conference and made a speech. I mean, he was like a 60-year-old man as a 14-year-old boy making this speech. And he actually became the leader of the Conservative Party for a while, but he was despised quite rightly by everyone in the country because he's an odious, slimy liar, basically. I mean, he just tells lies. He's a dissembler of untruths. That would be the parliamentary language for him. Anyway, he's David Cameron's right-hand man, and he's promising an EU referendum, but every time William Hague says anything, I always bet the opposite way. So if he says the sky's blue, I'll put money on it being red. He's just such a terrible, terrible person. So it is quite complicated. We've got this dance going on. Obviously, the Socialist Labour Party and the Socialist Liberal Democrat Party are pro-EU because they're pro-big bureaucracy, big government, big taxes, big regulation, politicians living the life of Riley, everyone else just basically being slaves to democracy. But David Cameron has promised this referendum. I think if he does win the next, he's probably hoping he doesn't. He's probably hoping that he just wins but needs coalition support from someone. And he'll then say something like, I wanted to have a coalition so that the Conservative Party could still be the government, but what I had to do is I had to give up the EU referendum. That's probably what he wants to happen. But let's say they do win strangely and bizarrely and actually have a clear majority, and he's forced to have an EU referendum. I think that we'll be out of the EU, and it would be against what the political establishment in Westminster want, including the political establishment of the Conservative Party. But it's the price the Conservative Party will have to pay to not be completely destroyed and evaporated by the UK Independence Party. So it's all quite interesting. I hope your listeners are following this. I hope it goes that way. I hope secession is arrived at, not because the politicians want it, because obviously they don't, but because there's no other way out for them to maintain their seats in their ministerial limousines.
Excellent. So now that we have this kind of overview of the political system, let's go into the Scottish referendum. And I know there's a lot of history behind it, so give us the brief history.
Oh, this is fantastic. Well, of course, you've got to remember, I mean, if we go, I'll throw in a little bit of history. I mean, a couple of hundred years ago, there was the Act of Union passed. Basically, the political elite, the political elite in Scotland did this huge, unsuccessful project in Panama called the Darien Project. They were about to be wiped out financially, so what they did is, against the wishes of the Scottish people, they basically sold Scotland to England. England had been trying to take over Scotland for 700 years, and finally they didn't have to fight for it. They were just given it for a big pot full of gold to the Scottish elite. Anyway, roll forward 200 years. You have the Scottish Nationalist Party, which is ostensibly really a socialist party, led by Alex Salmond. Now, Alex Salmond's main mission in life has been to make Scotland independent, to secede from England because of historical reasons, all sorts of reasons, pride and whatever else. I mean, Sir Sean Connery, who played James Bond in the best James Bond films, like Goldfinger and so on, has been a big supporter of secession and the Scottish Nationalist Party. Anyhow, so the Scottish National Party have grown and grown and grown and demanded more and more and more. And Westminster has given them more and more and more to keep them in the Union, because all politicians want to have bigger empires, because it makes their ministerial limousines bigger and they can swank around the world in bigger planes, and people listen to them if they've got more territory, more tax slaves contributing towards their coffers. So the Westminster establishment has tried to keep Scotland within the British Union. But the Scottish National Party has claimed more and more and more. And finally, Alex Salmond said, we want all these powers, which basically would have been Scotland is independent except foreign policies decided in London and the armed forces are directed from London. But virtually everything else would have been handed over to the Scottish. Now, here's the funny thing. It was supposed to be only called the Scottish Assembly, but Alex Salmond started calling it the Scottish Government. That really annoyed the British government in London. They said, no, you're not a government, you're an assembly. And Alex Salmond just made a plaque, put it on his desk, Scottish Government. And there was nothing the British people in London could do about it. Anyway, so they finally acknowledged, yes, it's the Scottish Government. So Alex Salmond said, I want all these powers. And David Cameron said, I'm not going to give you those powers. I'll give you a referendum instead. It was kind of a bluff. It was kind of call my bluff situation, high noon, because he didn't think Alex Salmond would go for it, because the polls have consistently been 60% in favour of keeping the Union, the United Kingdom, and only 40% in favour of secession and forming an independent country. So David Cameron called his bluff. He said, OK, you can have a referendum. And the whole of the Westminster elite were completely blithe and arrogant and didn't bother about this referendum because they thought it was easily going to be won in their favour, i.e. Scotland stays in the United Kingdom. But Alex Salmond said, OK, I'll take that chance. And he went for the referendum. And there was one poll came out a few weeks before the actual referendum, which showed that 51% of people who would vote in favour of secession. And this terrified the politicians in Westminster. Sorry, I'll have to cut that cough out there. Absolutely terrified. And they all rushed up to Scotland. They started promising them everything. They started promising them all these powers that Alex Salmond had originally asked for and been denied a couple of years earlier. So eventually there was the election. 55% of people voted no. 45% of people voted yes. Now, here's the really weird thing here. Most of that no vote, the 55% who said no to secession, most of them were pensioners on British government pensions, and they were frightened about losing their pensions in some way. So they were a bought and paid for government payroll vote. And 1 in 4 jobs in Scotland is a British government job. So many jobs, many government offices are put into Scotland. Many, if the government has a new department or a new office, they put it in Scotland. I mean, this is always the history of empires, isn't it? I think you have it in the United States where Hawaii and Alaska get a lot of welfare and subsidy to keep them in the empire. Same thing in Britain. The periphery places like Cornwall and Northern Ireland and Wales and Scotland, which would otherwise go independent, get a big chunk of welfare. So many British government jobs in Scotland, all those people didn't worry about the morality of where the taxation is taken from people and then given to them as salary. They didn't care about that. They just weren't worried about their salaries being taken away. And then all the British government pensioners worried about their pensions being lost, so they voted that way. But here's the weird thing. There's a lot of... The British government has always been seen to be extremely scrupulously fair, but for the first time in my lifetime, we've had stories of government vote rigging. We've had stories of votes being fixed, ballot boxes going missing, ballot boxes being stuffed with no votes, yes votes disappearing. And there's a huge amount of suspicion because in the few days before the referendum, if you went into most major Scottish cities, all you saw were people walking around with yes banners. You didn't see any no stuff at all. And then on the actual day of the election, 55% voted no. Now, I'm not sure whether there was vote rigging or not. I mean, I think all governments are completely corrupt, and in the end, I mean, the British government didn't get to have the biggest empire the world's ever seen by being nice. But I think it probably was a fair, what you might call a fair vote. But the rumours of this vote rigging, I think, are very, very powerful. And the other thing is most younger people in Scotland voted yes to referendum. It's the older generation who voted no. So as the older generation, shuffle off this mortal coil, to put it politely, and the younger people become a little bit older, a bit more powerful, I think that in a few years' time we'll have the Scottish secession again. What I think will happen is David Cameron in London will give the Scottish government all the powers he denied them originally before they got the referendum, if he can, and then they'll basically go up to being an independent country, except armed forces and foreign policies decided in London. However, here's the strange thing. A lot of Conservative MPs in the south of England would actually want Scotland to go independent. It's good for free markets. It's good to have smaller countries. The Labour Party will be crippled in England because of the way voting works. Scotland gets far more MPs than they should, in quote marks. So, and they've nearly always been Labour Party MPs in the past. So if Scotland did secede, the Labour Party in England would become a nothingness, an irrelevance. And the Conservative Party plus UKIP would run England in perpetuity, for 40 or 50 years. So a lot of Conservative MPs are going to say to David Cameron, you can't give Scotland these what are called devolution max powers. We're not going to vote for you to give him these things that he wanted, because we're only going to give you that if Scottish MPs can't vote in England on English-only matters. Here's a really weird thing. Currently, Scottish MPs can go down to London and vote on things which only affect England, but English MPs can't vote on things which affect people in Scotland. So I think a lot of Conservative MPs in the south of England will say to David Cameron, you're not going to give him these things unless Scottish MPs are not allowed to vote on English-only matters. So in a strange way, it might lead to England seceding from Scotland, sort of politically, but David Cameron probably won't agree to that, so therefore he won't be able to give these powers to Scotland, and then all the people in Scotland who want secession will say, David Cameron lied, he got the no vote because he promised us all these powers, he didn't deliver on those powers, therefore let's go for secession again. So either way, I think Scotland becomes more independent. Either David Cameron gives them these Devo max powers and they become virtually independent, or he doesn't give them the powers because he can't get the political support in Westminster, and so therefore the Scottish secession movement will rise up again and say he lied, he broke his promises, let's go for secession again. So either way, it's generally good for, I think, secessionary movements.
So you were saying that younger people voted more in favor of secession. I've seen a few charts and graphs saying the same thing. Do you think it's a kind of a permanent thing that will happen? Because I know in the U.S., a lot of young voters tend to vote more liberally, but then as they get older, their ideas seem to change. Do you think that's something that might happen with this too, or do you think as these young Scottish voters get older, they will continue to be for independence?
No, I think they will, because, it all depends on how history goes. I've no idea how history is going to go. I'm not a historicist like the Marxists are. But I think in the next few decades, we have an increasingly aging population in the UK because of many decades of welfare. You can read about these effects, that if you increase welfare, you decrease birth rates and so on. People don't feel they need to have children because they're going to lean on the state when they're older rather than leaning on their children. So you get these aging populations. And eventually what will happen is the British government will have to renege on all its pension promises. So all these pensioners in Scotland who voted basically for the British government in order to keep their pensions, when they have their pensions taken away or severely reduced by a major kind of demographic collapse in taxation and welfare payments, they're going to turn against the British government. I think these younger people, it's put a bit of a stake into the heart of Scotland. Actually, this election. Beforehand, people kind of got along with each other, but I think a lot of the Yes people are very angry about losing that vote, and I think they're committed secessionists now. Before they were ambivalent. Oh, here's an election coming along. I'll get to go and vote. Now they're committed secessionists, and I don't think they're going to change their minds now. And if the Scottish Nationalist Party and other secessionists in Scotland are clever, they'll drive this stake in deeper into the heart this divide in Scotland now. And as these older British government supporting people with their British government jobs and their British government pensions kind of fall away, I think your current younger generation will age, but as they age, they will stay secessionists. And then the new younger people will be even more secessionist. I think as well with I think as well with demographics and so on, and the growing failure of states and the nation states, I think people will see. I'm hoping that people will see that secession is a better thing. I mean, I think the same thing I hope will happen in the United States. I think as the United States degenerates with Obamacare and all the other things which are going to happen, hopefully people in Texas and other places in Alaska and so on will see the benefits of going it alone and not propping up all these welfare states in the northeast of the United States, and will get rid of all that welfare burden from all those older people in those places like Massachusetts, and will free themselves and will secede. So I'm hoping the same forces of secession in the United States will secede in with Scotland as well, and also other places in Europe like Catalonia, in Spain. There's been a big powerful secessionist movement there for hundreds of years. I mean, if you read the Aubrey Maturin series of novels by Patrick O'Brian, Stephen Maturin, the doctor there, is a Catalonian secessionist, which is fantastic. So there's been a big secessionist movement down there. I'm hoping that we'll see Belgium break up into Flanders and the Walloon, the French area. And I'm hoping secession basically spreads around Europe as the chaos of the Euro and the EU increases.
Yeah, and it looks like secessionist movements are picking up steam in the U.S. I think there was a poll a couple weeks ago that said about 24% now would support their state seceding. So that, of course, is very exciting. But taking a step back and looking at the more general principle of secession, obviously having smaller political entities is better for freedom and for liberty, but what are some of the other reasons to support secession movements as a whole? Because many people are skeptical when they hear the term secession.
Well, I mean, I don't know the American case that well, but from looking at it from afar, it seems to me the word secession is linked very heavily in your vocabulary to the word slavery.
Right.
So let's not go there. I'll leave you to...
Let's just look at it in general, whether it be secessionist movements in Europe or in Asia or in North America, wherever.
Yeah. If we take a country right down to its very, very smallest size, let's say a city. I mean, I'm an anarcho-capitalist, so I think there should be 8 billion countries and 8 billion people contiguous together. But let's take it down to what I call real world smallest thing. That would be Singapore or Hong Kong, or Andorra, or Monaco, or Liechtenstein, or a canton in Switzerland. If you take Singapore, it's extremely small. Everyone knows, almost personally, the politicians. When you're in a big country, like, say, the Soviet Union, you can be a politician in Moscow, and you can affect the lives of somebody in the Kamchatka Peninsula 5,000 miles away. And you two will never, ever meet each other. It's just impossible that you'll be able to meet each other. But you go to Singapore, and individuals, a taxi driver, might possibly know the Prime Minister of Singapore. So because of that personal relationship, it's much, much harder for a politician to be completely self-obsessed, to be completely detached, and to order people around. But aside from that kind of nature of there being personal relationships in a very, very small place, a very, very small place has to be free market. Singapore can't grow all the food it needs. It can't grow the coffee it needs. It can't mine the resources it needs. It just has its people, essentially, and a few very small resources, a few small bits of agriculture. So it needs to be free market to survive. It can't sustain huge bureaucracies, because it needs people to be doing business, importing and exporting and retailing and manufacturing and so on. So if you take a big country, say, let's say the United Kingdom, and then you break it down into Scotland and England and Wales and Northern Ireland, Scotland and England, once you separate them, you lose many of the major bureaucracies ruling over them. You can't sustain a huge bureaucracy over smaller countries. The power of governments evaporates. And if you go to the extreme case of all being individuals, the power of government has evaporated entirely. There is no power of government. You go all the way up to a global superstate, one country, the UN. If you remember the Firefly series, we'd call that the Alliance. With the Chinese and the American flag mixed together. Well, that's a hugely powerful bureaucratic structure, but you take it all the way down to the individual, and government has evaporated. And as I see it, every time you halve, say you take an island of 1 million people on it, and it's one country, you halve that island into two groups of 500,000 each, you have more than half the power of each of the constituent governments. So if we said that the unitary power of government is 100, if you halve that government, then each of the two governments left will have a power of 40 each, which will only add up to 80. If you quarter those governments, each of those 4 unitary governments will only have a power of 15, which would add up to a total power of 60. Every time you shrink a government, you more than shrink its power. And because you just need to be more free market. You need to, you have more personal relationships. You can't be these high-handed bureaucratic officials. You don't have so much taxation revenue that you can slop around different places. So you have to be much, much more frugal with your financing. You can't have this is key, I think, especially with the Federal Reserve. You can't have a massive central bank when you're a tiny little country like Singapore. You can't flood the world with Singaporean dollars to pay off all your government spending obligations. You just can't do it. You have to have a harder money. You have to have a freer enterprise system. You have to have more freedom. You have to have more free market in order to suck in the goods you need and to be able to sell the goods you need to sell in order to survive. So I think secession is always a good thing, even if it's from a Scottish nationalist party in Scotland who are really a socialist party. I mean, they see secession as basically allowing Scotland to become more socialist. And I'm okay with that. If that's what they want to believe, they can believe that. I mean, they're completely wrong, because a freer Scotland, a more independent Scotland, would have had to become more free market. And here's the best thing, of course. Many of our ideas of the free market, the Americans have as well, came to us from the Scottish Enlightenment, pre-1776. I mean, The Wealth of Nations, written in 1776, written by Adam Smith, a Scot from the Scottish Enlightenment. Now, Murray Rothbard has a very poor opinion of Adam Smith, so I won't go into that, but let's imagine Adam Smith was fantastic. Well, he was from the Scottish Enlightenment, from Scotland, the home of free markets. You've got David Hume, a great kind of, he wasn't really a free market philosopher, but many of his ideas fit in with libertarian values. So the smaller you go, I think the more free market you have to become. The power of government wanes significantly, and eventually, once we get down to the individual, it evaporates completely.
And you also have to have a more non-interventionist foreign policy as you get smaller political entities.
Right, we've got the United Kingdom at the moment. I mean, really, it's part of the US empire. It's a puppet tool of the American empire, and we supply to the American empire armed forces, the SAS and various things. Now, we could go into this quite a lot, couldn't we? But Britain is still just big enough to be able to make a big foreign policy statement, we're going to invade Iraq. What is Britain doing in Iraq? I've no idea what Britain's doing in Iraq. But you take that down to, say, England, and not Scotland and England, but just England, and can it be big enough to invade Iraq? Why? The money, etc. Maybe it's just on the cusp of being a ridiculous thing. I mean, Belgium wouldn't say we're going to invade Iraq. Holland wouldn't say we're going to invade Iraq. Denmark wouldn't say we're going to invade Iraq. You take England. Let's halve England. There's 3 nations in England, really. There's the Cornish, Celtic kind of historical code. So we'll take the Cornish to one side. I'm hoping that they'll go independent with the Kernow. They have a fantastic flag, by the way. It's a black background with a white cross. I love the Kernow. Fantastic. Cornwall should be independent. But the two Englands that are left is the north of England and the south of England. The north of England approximates to Danish, Viking, Norwegian invaders about 800 AD. Gives us the north of England accent, which I have a slight trace of. And then we have, that was the Dane law for a long time. The Danish law ruled the north of England. And then we have southern England, which is Anglo-Saxon. The Jutes, again, invaded England 400, 500 AD. They were under King Alfred the Great. So King Alfred the Great ruled southern England, Anglo-Saxon territory, and then the Danish ruled the north of England. So we've actually got three Englands. We've got Cornwall, north of England, south of England. Could the north of England invade Iraq? No, it's too small. It's ridiculous. Belgium wouldn't invade Iraq. Holland wouldn't invade Iraq. The north of England wouldn't invade Iraq. So as you shrink and shrink and shrink, again, look at the United States, okay? United States, world global military superpower. Can it invade Iraq? Yes, heck. It's done it three times in 25 years, or four times. I don't know how many times it's invaded. All being complete abject failures, of course, and made things worse for the people there, but let's not go into that.
Right.
But they can invade Iraq. But let's say America breaks down into 50 states. Would Texas invade Iraq? Well, I think Texas is probably the only state in the US that's big enough to do it. But would Vermont invade Iraq? No, it's impossible. Vermont is not going to invade Iraq, or Maine, or Iowa. Would Iowa invade it? No. I mean, I know Captain Kirk comes from Iowa, but you're not going to get Iowa invaded. But the United States, yes. China, yes. Russia, yes. But individual areas, it's ridiculous. So the foreign policy of Texas would be would include Oklahoma and a few states around it, and that would be about the foreign policy of Texas. What would the foreign policy of Hawaii be if Hawaii was independent? Well, it would, it'd probably have an embassy in Japan. It would probably have an embassy in California, an embassy in Alaska, and maybe one in Australia and New Zealand. But that would be about it. And it wouldn't be invading Iraq, would it? So the smaller you make any big country, the less militarily aggressive it becomes, as its taxation power and its central banking financing power is dwindled and dwindled and dwindled. Again, why did the British create this massive, massive empire, which included, of course, the United States at one point? Let's not get into that. It's because it had Bank of England financing. 1694, Bank of England created, I think one of the first real central banks. Paper money had just been invented in Massachusetts in 1690. A bright spark in London saw this and thought, that's a nice idea. Took that idea to the king, who had no money. He was, struggling with just France, never mind creating an empire. And then suddenly you've got this behemoth, colossus striding across the world, all financed by the Bank of England money printing operation. So central banking is a big part of this this backing of the sinews of war. I think it was Cicero, was it? It said infinite money are the sinews of war. So central banks and big countries backed by a lot of taxpayers who are forced to prop this thing up, creates these massive foreign policy aggressive actions. And so if we can shrink countries down, shrink the United States into 50 independent countries, or maybe even more, and they wouldn't cross the Atlantic or the Pacific anymore. What's the point? There's no need to do that. But England, Britain, UK is just about big enough to say let's send troops and air forces to Iraq. But as Cornwall or Wales or Northern Ireland or Scotland or England, it's just like Belgium. It's too small to do such things.
Excellent. We've had a great time talking with you, and we want to know, where can our listeners get more information from you? Do you have a blog or a website?
Well, I've run a couple of things. I mean, it's mainly for fun, really. I've got this site called mithrilmoney.com. That's MITHRIL money.com, where I put a few thoughts up on various things. I've also got a personal blog site as well. Just search for Andy James Duncan, and hopefully you'll get my WordPress blog. I've written under a pen name of Jack England. I've written a novel based on freedom, which is about the Greek and Persian wars, and that novel is by a guy called Jack England, who's amazing, who's kind of an amalgam of characters from Patrick O'Brien's Aubrey Maturin series. His name, and the book is Sword of Marathon. I'm also hoping to do something with Mises. I'm in close touch with Jeff Deist at Mises.org in Auburn, Alabama, and I'm hoping to do some kind of British Mises thing. So watch this space on that one. But that's pretty much it. I also do some financial videos as well, where I try to teach. I'm a financial lecturer by trade, and I try to teach people in these YouTube videos about various financial things on derivatives and stocks and shares and bonds and so on. So you can find me on YouTube. Again, look for Mithril Money there, which is MITHRIL and then money. That's pretty much it, really, I would say, for what I do. But I'm hoping to do more with Mises Institute in Auburn, Alabama, maybe form a kind of English offshoot in the future.
Excellent.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you very much. It's been a lot of fun and very, very, very interesting.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks very much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or subscribe on Stitcher. And check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.